Good evening. Thank you for joining us tonight for our 1510th lecture. I'm Ahn Valkenberg, the Secretary of the Royal Asiatic Society of Korea, and on behalf of the officers and councils, I welcome you to our lecture. By way of a reminder, lecture content does not necessarily reflect the opinions or positions of Royal Asiatic Society of Korea. The RAS Korea expresses sincere thanks to our generous sponsor, the Asia Development Foundation, and for their continuing support. We also especially thank Ms. Hee Jun-wook, who has made the use of this space at Class 5 possible. I should also note that watching tonight are members of the Donggucheon Foreign Language High School chapter of the RAS. So they're here watching on Zoom. So we are joined tonight by Robert Fouser, who holds a BA in Japanese Language and Literature and MA in Applied Linguistics, both from the University of Michigan, and a PhD in Applied Linguistics from Trinity College, Dublin. He studied Korean language at Seoul National University in the 1980s. He lived in Japan from 1995 to 2008, where he taught foreign language education at Kyoto University and developed the Korean language program at Kagoshima University. From 2008 to 2014, he taught Korean as a second foreign language education at Seoul National University. He's currently an independent scholar based in Providence, Rhode Island. He's the author of 6 books in Korean, including, to translate the titles, The Spread of Foreign Languages from 2018, How to Read Cities from 2019, but revised this year, Thoughts on Learning Foreign Languages from 2021, and this year's Why Do Cities Preserve History. He is also the translator of Understanding Korean Literature by Kim Hoon-yu and a co-author of Hanok, the Korean House. He writes regular columns for various media outlets in Korea and serves as deputy editor of Koreana. Tonight, he will discuss various attempts to reform Hangul during the 20th century. After the lecture, there will be time for questions. Please welcome Robert.
Thank you. Thank you for that very kind introduction, and I'm very honored to be here talking, giving a lecture at the RAS is kind of it's the last step in officially entering Korea. I kind of tell myself, you go through customs, you pick up your suitcase, you deal with jet lag, and then there's the RAS lecture. So it's an honor to be here, and I'm glad that all of you have decided to join me. This topic is not something like about cities or JK or anti-redevelopment. There's not a lot of activism, that kind of sort of controversial stuff in it. But what I've been, and this topic emerged from a long-standing interest in Hangul writing systems in general and how the Hangul relates to writing systems. So I've had a long interest in this. And so I'm very pleased to be able to present a talk on different reform proposals for Hangul in the 20th century. Is this forward? Okay, good. So I'll talk about divide this into different parts. One is Hangul and Hangul orthography. And this is the official South Korean romanization system. There are many others if you want to ask a question. Romanization is maybe about as controversial as redevelopment. I'll give a very short introduction to Hangul, and I know all of you know what it is, but I want to make sure that we're on the same page about certain linguistic aspects of Hangul. And then reform ideas number 1 is linear writing. That's writing Hangul in a line like, say, a Western language, a Roman language, English, any European language, Russian, of course, as well. And then another one is revised graphemes. So that's new Hangul letters. And then finally, the third one is typographic design. So how people tried to reform Hangul and why they did so and for what reasons. This is not about adding letters. It's not about changing things as much as changing the typography, which is quite an interesting argument that people have been involved in debates about this as well. And then finally, I'll give you a short conclusion. Can everybody hear me okay? I don't like to use a mic because as the introduction said, I taught in Japan for 13 years. And if you use a mic and you teach at a Japanese university, by the end of 90 minutes, 2/3 of your students will be asleep.
Most of us will be thankful.
Yes. So, I don't use a mic because it ends up putting people to sleep. But if you would like me to use a mic, are you okay with, does my voice carry? Jennifer, you okay?
I can hear her.
Yes?
So as long as you stay at the current level of volume, I'm okay.
Okay, so I will, when they ask you to turn up the air conditioning a little bit, I'll turn it up a lot. So, okay, so we're clear on that. This is Hangul, duh, all right. And a personal project of Kim Se-jung was completed in around this time and promulgated in 1446. So that's everybody knows this. This is what Koreans are taught in school. We all know this. But one thing interesting about the Hunmin Jeongeum is it's actually a rare explanation of a created writing system. So Hangul is, if you look at these dates, Hangul is actually much later than a lot of other writing systems. A lot of other writing systems emerged from something else. They gradually changed over time. There are other created writing systems. For example, Thai is a created writing system. There's a writing system for the Georgian language, Armenian language. You can start looking and digging around and you'll find a lot of different writing systems created for languages. But Hangul is actually quite recent in that endeavor. And it's one of the few where you have a book that was edited by the king or approved by the king that tells you about the writing system. Others, again, most writing systems have evolved from another writing system over time, so you don't have the record of what people thought about the writing system when they developed it. And then this one is a little bit controversial, debate over possible influences on Hangul. So there's this very emotional debate about the possible influences on Hangul. And that is this gentleman, Gary Ledgerd, who was a professor at Columbia University, who passed away in 2021. He pushed this theory that some of the Hangul letters came from this Pagspa script, which was a universal script developed or at the request of Kublai Khan for the Mongolian language when he ruled China. So the Mongolian Empire was this huge empire, and Kublai Khan wanted a universal language for Mongolian, a universal alphabet for Mongolian, and he asked a Tibetan Buddhist monk to create a new alphabet, and that Tibetan Buddhist monk created this script, this Pagspa script. And of course, a lot of it has influences from Tibetan. He was a Tibetan Buddhist monk. Gary Ledgerd promulgated or pushed, Gary Ledgerd pushed this theory that some of the shapes of Hangul letters came from this. And that theory was not well received among Korean language scholars, because Korean language scholars believe that Hangul was a creation of King Sejong, that there was, I don't want to say divine, that's not what they believe, but it was a unique, let's say the word unique, it was a unique creation by this great king. So the idea that King Sejong would be influenced by another writing system is somewhat controversial. But you can see that this is Gary Ledgerd's theory, is that these sounds they turned different sounds on their side, and that this Pagspa script influenced the shapes and of Hangul. This is a poster for a film, Not at Marsumi, which came out in 2019. And this film shows, it's sort of, obviously it's a drama, but it's a drama about a monk named Shinmi, who was close to King Sejong's wife. And the film presents the idea that the Buddhist monk Shinmi drew on Buddhist texts and of course the Bhagavad script as well. He drew on other languages to create Hangul. So it was a controversial film when it came out. In other words, it was advocating that Hangul was influenced by other writing systems. And that, of course, is contrary to what many Korean linguists believe. So this film was quite controversial. It's actually a very good film. King Sejong's wife, was a secret Buddhist, and King Sejong had her be the intermediary with this monk, and they developed Hangul in secret. And it's kind of a drama. There are no official records of any meetings that were held about making Hangul, that kind of thing. So this is kind of fiction, but it's really the first South Korean major film or South Korean media production that put forth this theory that Hangul was influenced by other alphabets. Yeah.
Just sorry to interrupt, but I heard.
Yeah.
That King Sejong had appointed a committee of scholars to go.
He did, yes.
Recorded somewhere? Or is that just made up?
That's recorded, but the notes of their meetings are detailed notes of what they would have done were not recorded. Wow. Yeah, because it was done in secret. But who participated, and the building is in Gyeongbokgung, and that part was yes, open. Yeah. Okay, so why do linguists like Hangul? Korean members of our audience, were you taught that Hangul is a scientific writing system?
Yes.
Yes. What did they tell you about that? If you mind telling us. I didn't go to elementary school in Korea, so. Vowel, yes, consonant vowel. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, so that's what Korean students are taught in school, that Hangul is scientific. Jeffrey Sampson is a expert on writing systems. There are many, but he's one expert on writing systems who proposed that Hangul is actually a featural system. So you have all these different types of writing systems. Phonographic is where you have writing systems based on sound. Logographic is based on an image. And then you have segmental, so that would be where you have linear, and then segmental, where you have letters lined up. And sometimes you have a consonant and a vowel together in the same letter, like Japanese. So if you look at a Japanese letter, you're not going to know what part indicates the consonant or vowel. It's just a unit taken together. So there's that kind of, and then they're lined up. And you have writing systems like Roman European languages where they're all lined up in a row. Sampson argued that Korean is a featural writing system, and it's a featural writing system that occupies this category by itself. So this is a unique feature of the Korean writing system, according to Sampson. So what does he mean by this? And this is where you get the scientific part of Hangul, what people advocate. A featural script has elements that indicate the components of articulation. So components of articulation is what you do with your mouth when you make a sound. And you have bilabial, these are all fancy words for different types of sounds, but these basic letters of Hangul indicate the location of the tongue. And to do that, you have to do this silently. You can't go in the shower and go gu 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 gu. It's harder. It's better to do it silently, where you feel your tongue in the back with a gyok or a g, that kind of sound. And then with an alveolar, this where you have an N sound, your tongue kind of goes, more toward the front. And a dental is where your tongue touches your teeth. So yeah, you can feel that inside if you imitate these sounds. Bilabial is two lips, right? So you have mium, right? So that's where it's all enclosed. And then glottal is where you have an open, something open, and you're open, the windpipe is open. So that circle indicates the openness of the windpipe. So this is the idea that Hangul letters indicate not everything, but indicate a good part of where you make the sound. So if you think of English, how do we know that's an L sound? There's nothing, there's no indication of where that sound is made in our mouth. We just know that that's what the sound is, or F or H or any of these sounds. They have no connection with how you make the sound. So that's where Hangul, this idea of Hangul as being quite scientific. There's another part, which is also interesting. And that's where you have another element added to indicate another type of articulation. So this is a non-aspirated, which means there's no air coming out. And then this is aspirated, where you have a k, you have air. And the best way to do that is if you have a piece of paper. Yeah. So we have a piece of paper, and this is how I taught Korean in Japan. You know, if you do an unaspirated, no air is supposed to come out, so the paper isn't supposed to move. So ga, ga, ka, ka, and the paper moves. So that means you're doing the air correctly. And that addition of the air is indicated by this line. And the same line is used to indicate, say, with a tia, right? Da, 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 ta, 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 ta. So if I'm supposed to do this correctly, it would be tabang, tabang, tada, tada. It's supposed to move. So you have this extra addition of an element. And the same thing, of course, can apply to the others. With piup, you have another line there. The shape changes, but it's an addition of a line. Then you have the fortis sounds, which are ga, ga, you know, you're doubling the sound. So it's a harder, almost like doubling of the sound. So the letter is doubled as well. So this is, for linguists, this will keep you up at night. It's exciting. It's wonderful because you have this, the writing system is giving you information about an additional linguistic feature. And that's something that linguists get excited about. So that is what people refer to when they say Hangul is scientific. And that leads to the question of if Hangul is scientific, which we agree, then, and therefore, if it's very well developed as a scientific, interesting, there are only 24 letters, it's easy to use on a computer or a phone. Why would people want to change it? Why would people want to improve it? Why would people want to alter it? So that's the main question of my talk. But before we get to that, it also applies to the vowels. So we have, these are the basic vowels, a, o, u. I don't know about my pronunciation anyway. But when you add another one, you add another line, what does that add? That adds a Y. And a Y is palatalization. So if you ever have the courage to listen to Putin speak, you have a lot of palatalization. Russian is a lot of palatalization in Russian language. Other languages have this too, not just Russian, but the addition of a Y sound is a palatal sound. So with the vowels, this addition of a line doesn't mean aspiration, as in with giok or tiak, those kind of things, giok, tiak, those kind of things. It means the addition of a palatalized element. So you have a, ya, ya, o, yo, u, well, where's u? U and u. You have another element. So this is where the line indicates something else. And it's very well organized, and it's a kind of a system. The other part is probably what a lot of students in Korea might learn in school, is that the vowels, this is a neutral, this is neutral, this is human. This little dot is the sun, which is yang, and the flat line is the earth, which is So you have yang, and neutral. So these lines represent a kind of geomancy, but that's not linguistic. That's not a linguistic feature. It's just a philosophical approach to how the vowels were organized. So that's what we have with Hangul being scientific, reflecting the way people, the formation of the sound in your mouth. So, but there's one problem, one interesting problem with Hangul. It's not a problem from our perspective. We're all used to this. But the graphemes, each of these pieces are organized into blocks. And this is the problem that in the 20th century, a lot of people wanted to deal with. You had, they are organized into blocks, much like Chinese characters. In other words, the blocks, the idea of organizing the graphemes, each individual letter or piece into a block comes from Chinese, okay? So this is what became a problem in the 20th century.
What was the deliberate attempt to emulate Chinese characters?
We don't have any records, but clearly this is from an old text. So you clearly see that that's what they were doing. In other words, a text was viewed as a bunch of blocks and you fill in with the appropriate character. So the next slide has, this is Chinese, and this is from the Dongnip Shinmun, I think. Dongnip Shinmun, so this has spaces in between, but you still have the letters organized into blocks. And this, of course, reflects Chinese. So why they did this is kind of a mystery, but this is definitely what was done at the time. Perhaps simply because that was what writing was. Writing was blocks that you filled in, and of course read this way as well, not this way.
Or the philosophy,
Yeah.
One syllable, one sound.
Sound, yeah.
Okay. One syllable, one.
That's also from Chinese as well. So yes, the idea of blocks that was the organizing principle. Yeah. So then we have linear writing, which is writing it all out. And there are three important people in this talk. One is Ju Si-gyeong, and probably many people have heard of Ju Si-gyeong because he was the leader of the Hangul revival. He was also the missionary Gail's Korean teacher. So he might be one of the first Korean as a second language teachers in history. Might be one of the first Korean as a second language teachers. So actually that's at Beije Hakdang, he was a student there, and he learned about English punctuation, spaces between words. He, was very much influenced by that kind of thing. But he was also a Korean teacher to Gail, and very early in the idea of reviving Hangul as the national language. Until the end of the 19th century, Hangul was not, official records were written in classical Chinese. So if you look at the annals of the Joseon dynasty, the Joseon Wangjo Shilyok, it's written in classical Chinese. Classical Chinese was the literary language, Hangul was not. So it was the idea of writing in Hangul was a very radical move at the time. And that is where you had, say, the Dongnip Shinmun was the first newspaper really written in only Hangul. If we can go back, this kind of writing only in Hangul. And of course, spaces between the words at the time was a very big innovation. So the idea was Hangul was developed by King Sejong. Hangul is the Korean alphabet. We don't need Chinese characters. And if you think of the Joseon dynasty, or before that, where for hundreds, maybe thousands of years, Chinese characters had been dominant in Korea, that was definitely a big step. So Ju Si-gyeong was a leader of the Hangul revival. He was also a leader in developing a grammar for Korean, okay? So that is important because he was a leader in developing a grammar for Korean, which was the first step, or an important step in teaching Korean to Koreans in school, developing a grammar that could be used to teach Korean as a second language at the time under the Japanese rule, but to teach Korean in school. So he was a leader, an important figure. He had two students. One student was Choi Hyeon-bae, who was the leader of the South Korean orthographic policy from 1945 to the 1960s. And Choi Hyeon-bae, if you are interested in him, he's a very interesting guy. He was from Ulsan, and they have a museum. His family, his descendants opened a museum to him in Ulsan, which is quite interesting. But he was he survived the Japanese occupation. Not everybody did, and he didn't go to North Korea. One other person who's very important did, and I'll talk about him in a minute. But he was a student of Ju Si-gyeong's. So he inherited the idea that Hangul is the language or the writing system that Koreans should use. Not mixed script, not mixing with Chinese, only Hangul. So the idea of only Hangul goes back to Ju Si-gyeong, his students, way early in the 20th century. And Choi Hyeon-bae is also interesting because when the American military occupied the southern half of the peninsula below the 38th parallel in 1945, one of the first things they did is try to find somebody to write a Korean language textbook because they wanted to open schools. Japanese had been taught, was the language that had been taught and pushed on the Korean people. And the American military government wanted to open schools but teach Hangul. So they very quickly found Choi Hyeon-bae because he was a noted linguist, and he wrote the first textbook for Koreans during the American military government. So it came out very quickly, and he became very active in the US military government, and then later in making language policy in the 1950s and 1960s. And he also had a run-in with Lee Seung-man because Lee Seung-man didn't like some of the irregular changes in Hangul. Kachi, for example, where it ends in a tiyut. Kachi ends in a tiyut. You add the I and the tiyut becomes a ch sound. Lee Seung-man didn't like that because he found that difficult. And so Lee Seung-man wanted to change Hangul so it would be kachi, gyuk, and then chi. He wanted to change it so it was pronounced like, it would be written like how it was pronounced. And Choi Hyeon-bae opposed that and very quickly put the kibosh on that. So he remained influential all through the 1960s. So it's kind of a strange question because here you have Choi Hyeon-bae, who wrote the first textbook for Koreans after the liberation from the Japanese, and he didn't write it in this kind of Hangul. I'm sorry, Ju Si-gyeong. We'll go to Choi Hyeon-bae in a minute. Okay. So this is Ju Si-gyeong's proposal for linear Hangul. And remember, I said that he was the person who advocated for using Hangul only at the beginning, the first major advocate for that. Why did he want to do this? Is a strange question. In other words, he wanted to do this, spread Hangul out. I can barely read it. I think this means Uri kul. Uri kul. Anybody read this better than me? Yeah? Uri kul. Li ka, it's hard work. So he wanted to split open the box and write it linearly. And this is from the 1910s. And of course, this doesn't mean that he didn't respect King Sejong. That's another story. The idea of keeping things more original is a more modern idea. What Ju Si-gyeong was worried about was the idea of teaching Hangul in schools. So he wanted to teach Hangul in schools so that it would survive under the pressure of Japanese imperialism. So he thought that teaching Hangul or writing Hangul linearly would make it easier to teach, more like a Western language, say. And he even gave this he ran this little school, and this was the certificate of having completed the program to learn Hangul. So Ju Si-gyeong was very much interested in literacy and in reviving the Hangul, alphabet among common people as a counterweight to the increasing control of the Japanese over the country in 1910. And of course, that meant over the education system. So that was the primary influence on Ju Si-gyeong, was to make a system that's easier to write, and at the time also easier to use on a typewriter and other sort of technological things. So later this kind of typewriter was developed, but the early typewriters could only do one, were sort of lined up you replace the Hangul letters with English letters, and it was lined up like this. So Ju Si-gyeong and printers, printing presses, these kind of things. So he was interested in making Hangul relevant amid the pressure of colonialism, which was the Japanese imperialism at the time. So this was his major interest. The thing that is important to understand is that Ju Si-gyeong died in 1914. So this is only 4 years after the official Japanese rule began. So he died at a very young age, and that is when people like Choi Hyeon-bae and others took up his cause. But this was Ju Si-gyeong's proposal, and he used it in this certificate of completion for the Korean language Hangul course that he ran. So probably we could say Ju Si-gyeong was the first experimenter with linear Hangul. And it's very interesting because he's the father of Korean modern linguistics, but he also played around with this linear Hangul at the time. And again, as I mentioned, typewriters were coming in. This is an Underwood typewriter. So in the question and answer session, if you know about, I think it's the Underwood family, there were all kinds of different experiments with typewriters, but it was a difficult task at first. Later, of course, about 1933 was where there was a typewriter that looked much more contemporary. So Hangul typewriting is long, but in the early 20th century, this was a difficult problem. Then we have Choi Hyeon-bae's proposal, 1947, just a year after he wrote the first textbook for students after liberation. And Choi Hyeon-bae, again, thought much like Ju Si-gyeong. He thought that the writing letters linearly was easier. And he thought that, and he wanted to make different types of letters. So this is sort of like printing, and this is like cursive. So you can definitely see that he had the influence of English, and you even have capital letters. These are capital letters, and he made some new letters, and these are non-capital letters, lowercase. So, and these are cursive capital letters, and these are lowercase cursive Hangul letters, and he put some Roman letters in there and changed Hangul to look more like Roman letters. And this is because he, following Ju Si-gyeong, he had the idea that linear writing was easier. But in the book that this was published in 1947 is called Choi Hyeon-bae, or the Revolution in Letters. And that book, he argued quite extensively that this kind of writing was more modern, and that the block, keeping Hangul together in a block was the influence of Chinese, that it wasn't a modern writing system. So this kind of writing was, unquote, more modern. So he wanted to modernize the Korean language. And remember, 1947, he kind of had his own leeway because the US military government was in the southern half of Korea. So Choi Hyeon-bae could kind of feel the freedom to experiment. He'd been asked to do the textbook. So he was kind of playing around with the idea of how can we make Hangul look more like a Western language? How can we modernize Hangul? And this is what he came up with. Again, very hard to read, and some of the letters are added or changed, but it's all, some of them look, that's maybe a jiat, and different letters that have been taken. That's a hiat, I think, and we have different, he's kind of changed them around. And then, thanks to Matt kindly sent me 2 articles. We have other experiments continued, but it's all, the other experiments in linear writing all follow the same kind of idea that this is a modern approach to write to Hangul, that it somehow is better. So we have horizontal cursive Hangul sought as beneficial reform, Korea Times, 1965. And this is a gentleman named Kim Se-hwa, I think, who proposed this system. And this was during his life. And then later his family released this posthumously. And it made an article in the Korea Times. In 1962, Richard Rutt, who was a very famous missionary in Korea, advocated wrote an article about the possible benefits of this linear Hangul. So this was continued, people continued to talk about this in the all the way up into the 1960s. And of course, Romanization was also reformed at this time. The once hated sort of old-fashioned Romanization system where Dongnim Moon became Dog Rip Moon, right? That Romanization system. So there was not just Hangul, but there were reforms and other things as well going on at the time. But for Hangul, this kind of linear writing was talked about, and there were many different proposals that came out. Kim Se-jong, sorry, not Kim Se-hwa. Kim Se-jong was the gentleman mentioned in the Korea Times article. And again, you know, his idea was cursive. Somehow that there was something that needed to be changed. Hangul needed to be changed to be sort of more like a Western language or easier to write. I don't know how you feel, but I have met non-native speakers of Korean who say that Hangul is difficult to write. I don't really have that problem because I can't remember writing Hangul at extreme lengths by a pen because now I use a computer. But, you know, I have heard that some people say their hands get tired. It's kind of a crazy idea. So maybe there was some of that, but, you know, linguists don't like this idea that one language, your hand gets tired and the other language, your hand doesn't get tired. That's not a very appealing idea to linguists because linguists have a more universalist approach to languages. So anyway, this was one proposal. And another one by Kim Tu-bong is a proposal, this 1922, and Kim Tu-bong was another student of Ju Si-gyeong. He went to North Korea after the division. And I'm Romanizing this in the North Korean style. Instead of using a D, I'm using a T because that's how he's Romanized in North Korea. But he proposed a linear Hangul system as well. And this is, again, a cursive version. And then this is a more printed version. So this was another very early experiment, probably the first one after Ju Si-gyeong's himself. So this was another experiment. But again, the idea was that if you do this, it's easier to print, it's easier for people to learn. That was in the 1920s, that was an idea that continued from Ju Si-gyeong. Okay, so then revised graphs, the next reform. First is linear. The next is revised graphs, meaning changing the letters, adding new letters, not just changing the shape or the way they're written. And Kim Tu-bong, as I just said, was a student of Ju Si-gyeong, and he was a leader of early North Korean orthographic reforms. So after the cut at the 38th parallel, the North Koreans had their own, a lot of intellectuals or people active in cultural circles went to North Korea. Kim Tu-bong was one, and he ended up being purged in 1957. He had an argument with Kim Il-sung, who somebody you don't want to argue with, but he did, and he was purged. So a lot of what he had done in North Korea did not last, but still his influence is still can be felt there. His most radical proposal was a revised orthography, started in 1948. Which included 6 new Hangul graphemes. So 6 new Hangul characters, okay? Hangul characters. And that was abandoned in 1954 because it was too difficult or too weird, to deal with. And I'll show that in a minute. This is another proposal that came out in South Korea that's related to the idea of revising the graphs completely. The North Korean revised orthography is where you have these 6 new letters, okay? These 6 new letters, and 2 of them are obsolete or old Hangul letters that were revived. These 2. These are created, and these are Kim Tu-bong's creation. These are, revived. And what he wanted to do, and if anybody takes a TOPIK or you learn Korean as a foreign language, you know that Korean teachers like to do this kind of question on you, right? Kedatta, and this is what is this called? It's called irregular verb, or kedatta, this digut changes to a diel, right? Kedarasuni, and you have this sort of irregular change. So there's a bunch of irregular changes, and what Kim Tu-bong wanted to do is develop a new character where you didn't have to change the letter. He didn't like this because it was irregular. In other words, irregularity to Kim Du-bong was a sign of something not being perfect. So he wanted to make the language more perfect by developing a character that didn't need to be changed. And that, of course, is from our good Squid Game. Right, this is the Squid Game symbol. But anyway, he revived this. And so this revived character is used in situations where you have a deal and a diga, this kind of situation where you have this type of change. So this was what Kim Du-bong proposed, was to make Korea. I think this is for a biup dropping, biup, right? Or, you know, I remember when I learned Korean, the teachers would say, oh, this is a biup dropping verb. And we'd get together at break time and say, why does the biup drop? And one of us would have the courage to ask the teacher, why does the biup go away? And the teacher said, because it does. Which is what I would say if I were teaching English, right? So, you know, you have this, the idea was to even make Hangul more perfect. That was Kim Du-bong's idea. So we have again, this one and this one, which are obsolete graphemes. These were revived to, you know, fill in the gap according to Kim Du-bong, and these others were not. But this, of course, I remember seeing this all throughout during when Squid Game was popular. You'd see, you know, even a cafe name for Shiat, instead of Shiat, they would use this. So it kind of drove me insane because the sound is actually more like a Z sound, which is an obsolete sound that has disappeared from modern Korean. So the next one is Choi Hyeon-bae, who is just somebody, not a famous linguist, but wrote a book, which I happen to be lucky to get into possession. And this is where he's creating an entire kind of new graphs, or really revising Hangul so that it's even more radical changes than what Kim Du-bong or Choi Hyeon-bae had proposed. And it's interesting that this alphabet, or this Kim Du-bong, not Kim Du-bong, Choi Hyeon-bae's proposal looks kind of like the Cree language or Shavian. Has anybody seen the George Bernard Shaw letters for English? Shavian, kind of a very strange, you know, sort of creation, almost could be Morse code even, or something like that. So this is another proposal where he wanted to make Hangul perfectly phonetic. In other words, you don't have the thing of kachi where the tia changes to a chi sound, or you have these different irregular changes. I remember when I learned Korean, I came here on you know, Korean Airlines from LA in 1983 and got here. I was told Hangul was easy. And then I was, you know, learning Korean, and Jongno, the do changes to a no, and Chollado, you know, and I could easily say Jonnado, right? I could say Jonnado, Shinda all the time. And the teachers would say it was easier to pronounce, you know, Cholla is easier to pronounce than Jonna. So, you know, there's all kinds of little details you have to learn when you learn Hangul. I sort of felt for maybe the second month in Korea, I felt a little cheated, like I'd been told it was easy. But so that's where these guys are, you know, trying to make Hangul perfectly phonetic. In other words, no irregularity. And again, this ties into Kim Du-bong's approach. And this is another book that I have in my possession that shows all kinds of, there are about 40 some different proposals in this book for how to improve Hangul, how to make it, you know, linear, how to add new characters to deal with the irregularity problem, which is not very large. I mean, all languages have irregularities in them, but if you view the idea that Hangul is a perfect system, then that's something you would want to get rid of. So there's this effort in people experimenting around to try to make Hangul more perfect. Then the third thing that happened, and this is interesting, is typography design. One is Kim Jong-soo's leaning Hangul design, and the next is Ahn Sang-soo, who is a very famous typography designer in Korea. He used to be a professor at Hongik University, but then left and founded a design school, Pati in Paju, so very active still today. And he developed interesting fonts beginning in the 1980s. And this is Kim Jong-soo's leaning Hangul. and probably all of you are going, going to get jet lag, but why did he want to do this? Anybody have an idea? Why would you do this?
Italics.
Huh?
For italics.
Not for italics, but that's a good answer. But he had this idea that this is easier to read. And again, it's a rejection of that block concept, the idea that blocks of little Hangul characters are somehow hard to read. And I get this sometimes, from people who say that, these blocks of Hangul letters are hard to read. I don't really have that problem, but the idea was if you change the typography, somehow Hangul will be easier to read. So outside in the sort of world of language, there are people who think that Hangul is not easy to read. So they wanted to.
It could also have been, it's easier to write because you have this line.
Could be, yes, yeah. You're able to kind of flow, yeah, because you're with your right hand. So that's another good, observation. So again, this ties into the idea that there's something that needs to be perfected with Hangul. So this is Kim Jong-soo's proposal. I kind of get dizzy when I look at it, but I can sort of see where, this is easier to deal with than linear writing for sure. Choi Hyeon-bae, you can kind of look at it and it's like, wow, this I can at least read, pretty, rather easily. But italics is an interesting question, Jacko, because I remember years ago, I asked a Korean linguist friend, professor at Seoul National University, why doesn't Korean have any italics? And he's a very famous guy, and he kind of answered, I don't know. And he then said, bold is, South Korean doesn't use bold because North Korea uses bold for Kim Il-sung. So that was, at the time, the answer. Things may have changed. Sorry, this is, yes, Ahn Sang-soo's fonts. And Ahn Sang-soo developed these fonts in the 1980s. And what these did is, what do you notice about these other than that they look kind of modern and cool and chic and hip and blah, 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 blah. What else do you see? What's the key point of these fonts? They broke the box.
Yeah.
Okay. So in other words, not the top line, but actually a little bit because the gyeok, and see, this is a different size. The lower line is all offset. So you have yoksa, this is 3 characters, and that's longer than one with 2. So the size of the box is different. So yoksa, this is smaller, ida is smaller than jim, seesang-e, right? So you have a different size. So Ahn Sang-soo broke the box, but he was different from the other people who tried to do it. This stuck. In other words, Ahn Sang-soo's fonts are still used. They're highly regarded. He's highly respected. So he was able to break the box without causing friction or without causing trouble, okay? So this is, and his idea was if you break the box, you have better readability. That was with this, these fonts are more readable. So we'll give you this is a semi-gipunbul, which when I lived in Korea in the 1980s, I bought every month, and I had many of them, and I wish I hadn't thrown them away. Never throw books or magazines away. But again, you can see this was Ahn Sang-soo's logo became the logo for the magazine, and this is again much smaller than these. And instead of a box, it's more of a rectangle. And then this is Kwahak Donga, which still exists. This is from last 2023 October issue, and again there's a different size. So Ahn Sang-soo was really the first successful person who broke the box without causing a lot of controversy. So conclusion is, again, it comes back to this idea of people have been critical or have wanted this idea of breaking up the letters, whether it be linear writing, Ahn Sang-soo's writing, playing around with new characters. This has dominated a lot of the discussions about Hangul reform. But not everybody wants Hangul reform. So that's that's why you have two different approaches. One is Hangul as perfection. So that's more of the orthodox approach that you would get, say, in schools, more of the sort of orthodox approach that respect for King Sejong. King Sejong created Hangul. You don't want to fiddle around with it. You don't want to change it. Respect for the struggle to create independent national culture. So Hangul is a symbol of the struggle to, for Korean language to survive during the Japanese imperial period. And the idea of, Hangul is being unique, scientific. So if this is what you think Hangul is, then it's already perfect, so you don't need to do anything. So then debates are about maybe how to write certain words. For example, mu, which is used for kakdugi. When I first came to Korea, that was written mu and then an u at the end. Hesumnida was bia, niung instead of a shiat. So there were various phonetic changes or sort of writing orthographic changes that took place in 1988. So that kind of thing you could mess around with because, that's not necessarily what King Sejong advocated, but those are minor changes compared to some of the others that were proposed. So this is the sort of orthodox standard idea that Hangul is already perfect. The next one is Hangul as perfectible. So the approach that the idea that there's something that needs to be changed. Linear Hangul is that. We have typing, printing, and of course the big thing, say from Choi Hyeon-bae's time, but going into the 1960s, this idea of a break, it's modern. Linear Hangul is modern. You're trying to create a more modern, somehow the idea that some language is more modern than the other, which linguists don't like that kind of thing. And a break from Chinese and various proposals for revised graphemes, new typology, and part of the new typology, not just Kim Jong-soo, but of course Ahn Sang-soo as well, is to increase readability. So there's a belief that Hangul needs to be more readable, or you can play around with the shape of the letters to make it easier to read, that kind of thing. So this is what has driven people to advocate different changes and reforms in Hangul. What does the future hold? The problem is the future, a lot of the proposals from the mid-20th century were related to writing by hand, that kind of idea that Hangul needs to be easier to write or simplified or something. Nowadays, people don't write by hand. So the idea of Hangul being writable by hand is no longer as serious considered. I mean, it might be, but it's not a serious consideration because people use computers. And readability is the same thing. You have all kinds of choices of fonts, so you don't really need to worry about the font relating to readability because, again, the digital revolution has changed that whole discussion about how how people look at writing and reading languages to begin with. So then we have what are possible future directions. That leaves only typography design as the place where people will experiment around. Nobody is proposing linear Hangul anymore. Nobody is proposing new Hangul letters. And nobody is proposing to really change the orthography to make Hangul easier because compared to other languages, it's not that hard. And, that's just no longer an issue. So a lot of the issues related to this are they have that 20th century, mid-20th century sort of aura to them. The typography design is where that's one that's left for people to experiment and play with. And San Ulim, yeah, this is one of my favorite group sound. But anyway, this is their second album cover. And so really playing around with letters, of course, has a long tradition in South Korean pop culture and that kind of thing. And then we have these interesting letters, which in the third album cover were much more simplified and look more like traditional Hangul. So again, you can have this kind of, aesthetic playing around with Hangul. These are Baemin Klimche, which is making different it almost looks like Mayan or Egyptian hieroglyphics or something like that, where you have different, you fill in the Hangul with designs and things like that. And Baemin is Pedal Minjok, which is a design group that has developed all kinds of interesting Hangul fonts and designs. So this kind of thing, playing around with the aesthetics of the letters will probably continue. But the other stuff that was active in the 20th century is basically, I'm talking about an historical period that probably, almost certainly, will not come back. So that's it. So here are some references this is Choi Hyeon-bae, Revolution of Letters. So that's Choi Hyeon-bae's famous book. I think it's downloadable online, but there are other references here that you can see if you wish. And this is I read the 1985 version, but there is a more updated version of this book, which has, I think it's 2015. But when I was preparing this, I used this version because the details about Hangul are a little more. The updated version has about some discussion of the details of attempting to teach Hangul to the people, the sort of tribe, the indigenous people in Indonesia. But that's a topic of another discussion, another lecture. So thank you very much.